Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Good to be here.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a stack of sources that shed some really intense light on the multi-layered tensions between Israel and Iran.
Yeah, and frankly, what some potential next steps and consequences could look like, which gets pretty heavy as you dig in.
It's certainly a critical subject, isn't it? And what our sources seem to reveal is just how much is happening beneath the surface, beyond the headlines we typically see.
Absolutely. There's a depth of complexity there and some potential outcomes discussed in these reports that are quite striking.
For sure. We've been digging through reports from a mix of pretty reputable news outlets. We've got pieces from the Financial Times, the BBC, the Wall Street Journal.
Right, each giving us a slightly different angle on this whole simmering and sometimes, let's be honest, boiling situation.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive, basically to try and cut through some of the noise.
We want to pull out the crucial, maybe even surprising insights from these sources, really try to understand the potential scenarios they're talking about.
Including some pretty alarming worst-case possibilities that they detail.
Definitely. And see why this all matters, not just for the region itself, but potentially for you, the listener, and maybe the wider world, too.
Yeah, we're aiming to give you a clear, maybe more granular picture of the incredibly high stakes involved here, drawing directly from the intelligence and the analysis presented in these articles.
Precisely. So whether you're glued to the news, following every twist and turn, or maybe just trying to get a handle on this incredibly intricate situation.
Which is understandable. It's a lot.
It is. We're here to guide you through the key takeaways and maybe the most compelling details our sources have brought to light.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's just jump straight in, maybe.
Let's do it. How about we start with something that, honestly, on the surface, sounds almost too dramatic to be true. This comes from the Financial Times.
Right. That FT piece, let's kick things off there because it suggests something potentially really unexpected, maybe even provocative, involving Saudi Arabia and former President Trump.
So the core idea, at least initially floated in this FT article, is the suggestion that Saudi Arabia might have struck some kind of deal with Donald Trump, specifically before a potential Israeli strike on Iran.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold suggestion when you first read it, the implication being that Saudi Arabia essentially, quote, offered Tehran on a silver platter to Trump, almost like greenlighting or, helping facilitate an attack on their regional rival.
Which sounds huge. And the specific piece of evidence cited in the article to back up this rather dramatic claim, it points to OPEC, or more specifically the OPEC Plus group, significantly increasing oil production before Trump potentially giving the nod for Israel to strike Iran.
Okay.
The FT piece highlights a specific number here, a 411,000 barrels per day increase starting the following June. Plus, it notes raised production quotas for key individual member states within OPEC, plus there's mentioning Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Kazakhstan, Algeria, and Oman. A pretty wide group.
So the argument implied by the article's initial framing, and it's really important we stress this at the initial framing, is that this production increase wasn't just market fluctuation.
Right.
It was supposedly a deliberate move, strategically timed, to sort of cushion the global oil market, against the potentially massive price spike that would almost certainly happen if Iran's oil infrastructure or its export capabilities got hit in a strike.
Making the economic fallout less severe, which could, hypothetically, make a big strike like that more politically palatable, maybe?
That seems to be the implication. It sounds, on its face, like a remarkably calculated, almost Machiavellian strategic move between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia.
It does. But here's exactly where the same FT article gets really, really interesting and complicated, because it immediately presents a counter-argument, a very different perspective, based on conversations the reporters apparently had with U.S. officials.
Ah, okay. So not everyone agrees with that initial take.
Not at all. According to these U.S. officials quoted in the piece, this whole deal idea, they labeled it, and I'm pulling this directly from the source here, as nonsense or unrealistic.
Nonsense.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty blunt. Did they say why?
They did. They offered several very specific reasons for their skepticism, which really changes how you view that initial claim. Firstly, they argued that OPEC's earlier strategy, remember those production cuts they were trying?
Yeah, trying to prop up prices.
Exactly. It simply wasn't working as intended long term. In fact, the source says they were losing market share over 3 years without actually getting the sustained price increase they wanted.
Right. So for OPEC plus D, increasing production actually made good economic sense for them anyway, regardless of Iran.
Precisely. It was potentially more about market dynamics, regaining share, not necessarily military planning for an attack on Iran, driven by internal OPEC economics.
Okay, that's one point. Any others?
Yep. The U.S. officials also pointed out something crucial. OPEC didn't need to make some specific deal tied to a potential strike. Increasing production was just a logical step based on their own market analysis at that time anyway. It didn't require some secret geopolitical pact.
Gotcha. So the timing might have just been coincidental or driven by separate factors.
Could be. And here's another point from the U.S. officials that seems to directly contradict that silver platter idea. They stated that Trump's actual request to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states previously was pretty consistently to lower oil prices.
Lower them.
Yeah, use lower prices as a tool to put economic pressure on Iran, Russia, and China, not to raise production specifically to enable an attack on Iran. That's a fundamental difference in the objective they're describing.
That is a critical distinction. Lower prices to hurt rivals versus higher production to enable an attack. Very different goals.
Totally different. And the source quotes these U.S. officials saying that the key Arab countries involved, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, were specifically named, actually had a kind of unified agenda against Trump taking military action against Iran.
They didn't want it.
Apparently not. They were worried about the regional instability it would cause.
Which, again, completely undermines the idea that they were somehow facilitating a strike by offering Iran up, right?
Exactly. It paints a picture of Gulf states being pretty wary of escalation, not eager for it.
Okay, so the Financial Times article, it starts with this really eye-catching, almost sensational headline about a deal.
Right.
But when you actually dig into the details and the counter perspectives, it presents within the same piece.
It offers a much more nuanced and frankly kind of contradictory picture.
So what was the deal then, according to the U.S. officials? Or was there no deal at all?
Well, the U.S. officials quoted in the source, they presented a sort of refined idea of what a deal might have looked like between Trump and the Saudis, if one existed at all.
Okay, a different kind of deal.
Yeah. They suggested that if there was any kind of quid pro quo going on, it was more likely about Arab states trying to acquire advanced U.S. technology.
Like what?
Things like cutting-edge AI chips, maybe sophisticated weapon systems. Basically, tech they might only be able to get from a Trump administration, perhaps, rather than something as volatile and risky as helping set up a strike on Iran.
Okay, that kind of deal, focusing on tech acquisition, that makes maybe more strategic sense from the perspective of Gulf states wanting to modernize their economies and defenses.
Right. Compared to actively pushing for a military confrontation with a powerful neighbor that would immediately destabilize their own region, it seems more plausible, perhaps.
It highlights a completely different motivation, long-term technological goals versus short-term, high-risk geopolitical maneuvering for a military strike.
Absolutely. So what does this initial deep dive into just this one Financial Times piece really tell us when we look at the whole thing?
Well, it screams complexity, doesn't it?
It really does. It tells us that international relations, especially at this level, dealing with things like oil, potential military conflict, they're incredibly complex.
Yeah, often involving multiple, sometimes hidden, sometimes even contradictory motivations. Economic strategy, military stuff, tech goals, worries about stability.
All potentially swirling around at the same time and not always what they seem on the surface. And crucially, I think it shows how difficult it is, even for top journalists digging into this, to definitively report on the true nature of these behind-the-scenes interactions between states.
For sure. You really have to read critically, look at all the angles presented, even within a single article. It underscores the opacity, the difficulty in verifying information in this world of high-stakes diplomacy and, intelligence games.
Definitely. Okay, let's unpack this further then. Let's shift gears entirely. Move away from the potential diplomatic and economic angles to some really specific, almost unbelievable operational details. This comes from a fascinating piece in the Wall Street Journal.
The WSJ piece. Yeah, this one is quite different. It dives deep into the tactical realities, the intelligence side of the conflict.
It really does. It grapples with a critical, almost baffling question about some recent operations targeting Iran.
The Wall Street Journal article we looked at, it zeroes in on this really fascinating question. How did Israel manage to get the drones reportedly used by the Mossad inside Iran to strike Iranian air defenses?
Yeah, the implication isn't just that drones flew, 1,000 miles and somehow slipped past everything. The source seems to be suggesting something far more intricate.
That's exactly right. The core revelation, as presented in the WSJ article, is that some key Israeli strikes on Iranian air defenses weren't primarily achieved by external airstrikes, planes launching from outside Iran,
What happened?
by drones launched from inside the country.
Wow. Okay, that fundamentally changes the nature of the operation, doesn't it?
Totally. It implies a very deep, probably very long-term intelligence infiltration operation was necessary to make that happen.
And the source doesn't paint this as some quick recent development either.
No, not at all. The article emphasized this wasn't improvised. Israel had reportedly been working on building this kind of capability for years.
Years. Years of planning, setting up networks, training people.
Exactly. The source describes the reported method for this pretty elaborate intelligence effort. Israel apparently trained intelligence cells and small teams in a third country.
A third country. Okay.
And here's a crucial detail they mention. This country reportedly had similar environmental conditions, complexities, governmental structures, similar military and police presence
Yeah.
to Iran itself.
So they could run realistic training scenarios, stuff that would be hard to replicate elsewhere.
Precisely. Think about that level of meticulous, almost obsessive preparation, replicating the operating environment to train agents for deep cover operations.
Incredible. And then there are the reported infiltration methods themselves, for actually getting the drone components inside Iran. According to the source, these sound almost like something out of a spy thriller.
They really do. The source details several specific, pretty ingenious methods reportedly used. The drones weren't smuggled in whole, obviously.
Right. Too big, too obvious.
Yeah. They were broken down into parts, very small, nondescript-looking parts.
Into parts. Okay, and how do they reportedly get those parts in?
Well, the article mentions they were carried in things like suitcases by individuals crossing borders.
Just in suitcases.
Apparently. And it adds this very specific, maybe slightly suggestive detail, noting that Iran has a significant Jewish population. The implication, perhaps, is that this existing community or its connections might have played some role in facilitating movement or providing cover. Though the source is careful, it doesn't explicitly make that direct link.
Okay, using existing populations or travel routes to blend in. That makes sense from an intelligence perspective.
It's a classic technique.
Yeah.
The source also reports that parts were hidden within larger, legitimate cargo shipments.
Ah, so not just personal luggage.
Right. Think about this. Disguised as parts of, say, ceramics shipments or other industrial goods, made to look like entirely innocuous components within a larger manifest, embedded within commercial supply chains.
Wow. And infiltration reportedly happened through various entry points.
Yeah, not just airports, ports, land borders, other locations. Leveraging the complexity of Iran's own huge transportation network against itself, in a way.
And the key, according to the source, was that the individual drone parts were reportedly very small.
Very small, and crucially, didn't obviously look like drone components on their own.
So they wouldn't trigger immediate alarms during routine checks. Makes detection incredibly difficult without specific intelligence pointing right at them.
Exactly. Avoiding immediate identification as military hardware is obviously vital for this kind of deep infiltration.
So why go to all this incredible effort? What was the strategic significance of this whole infiltration strategy? What did it enable?
Well, the strategic impact, as the source describes it, was immense. By launching these drones from inside Iran, these Israeli intelligence assets could strike Iranian air defense systems from the interior. Meaning the air defenses could potentially be disabled or degraded before Israeli aircraft even had to enter Iranian airspace.
Ah, clearing the path.
Essentially. The source describes this capability as a massive military and intelligence penetration.
A massive penetration. I mean, just think about that level of long-term planning, the resources involved, the risk, the execution.
It's staggering.
It really shows the depth of the shadow war being fought, doesn't it, in the intelligence realm, and the extraordinary lengths agencies might go to achieve objectives that maybe conventional military means just can't.
Yeah, operating deep inside hostile territory, bypassing layers of external defense. It's a demonstration of really sophisticated patient intelligence work, culminating in a direct operational impact. It's not just about the hardware, it's the human intelligence, the networks, the ability to operate undetected over years.
Okay. So while some operations like this reported covert infiltration are already happening, showing the conflict is very much active on certain, hidden levels, what about the potential future? Where could this escalating tension between Israel and Iran actually lead?
Right. And here's where our deep dive gets really serious. maybe even alarming, according to the BBC's analysis, which focuses specifically on worst-case scenarios.
Yeah, this BBC article we reviewed, it doesn't pull any punches, does it?
Not at all. It asks a critical and, frankly, pretty terrifying question. What is the absolute worst-case scenario for the conflict between Israel and Iran?
And the source makes it clear they're not just talking about the initial thought most people might have, which is maybe just the U.S. getting drawn into direct military involvement.
No, the BBC analysis goes much, much deeper into potentially more catastrophic possibilities.
Much deeper, exploring consequences that could honestly reshape the region and probably beyond. They outline several major scenarios, each with potentially devastating implications. The first scenario they discuss is the possibility of failure. Failure to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities.
Right. The core risk here, as identified by the BBC analysis, is if Israel mounts significant military operation, but cannot succeed in destroying Iran's key nuclear facilities.
And the source specifically mentions the ones reportedly located deep underground.
Exactly, making them extremely challenging targets, even for advanced conventional bunker-busting weapons.
And why is this failure considered such a catastrophe, according to the source?
Because it essentially leaves the fundamental threat unresolved, maybe even makes it worse. It ties back to Iran's stated position. The source recalls a message Iran reportedly sent to Israel via Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA.
Okay, the nuclear watchdog.
Yeah, essentially stating that a large-scale military operation against Iran could be the very trigger that pushes Iran to make the political decision to actually seek a nuclear bomb.
Like, the attack itself could provoke the outcome it was trying to prevent.
That's the fear expressed. And the source points to Iran's current capability as proof of how close they might already be to that threshold if they decided to cross it.
What are the specifics there?
It states that Iran already possesses 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium.
400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. Okay, and how significant is that?
Well, the source describes this specific amount as very, very close to the level needed for a nuclear explosive device. That's typically considered 90% enrichment.
So 60% is almost there.
Pretty close. And alarmingly, the source claims it doesn't require an extraordinary level of sophisticated scientific knowledge or capability to convert that 60% uranium to the 90% weapon-grade level.
Implying that conversion could happen relatively quickly if the political decision is made.
That's the suggestion. And adding another layer of concern, the source notes a really worrying detail about where this 400 kilograms is reportedly stored.
Where? Not in the known facilities.
Apparently not. It claims it's not kept in the declared nuclear facilities that are subject to, some level of international monitoring, but allegedly in secret mines or other undisclosed locations.
Secret mines?
Yeah, locations that are extremely difficult, maybe impossible, for outside powers to verify or target effectively.
Wow. Okay, so the terrifying implication of this first worst-case scenario is if an attack happens, but the nuclear facilities aren't destroyed, maybe because they're too deep or too dispersed or hidden, then even if other military targets are hit, the whole operation could be seen as a strategic failure.
Right. It would leave Iran, according to this analysis, potentially on the very verge of nuclear capability, having maybe been provoked by the attack into making that final leap.
And the source states the only real solution presented to prevent this outcome is the successful destruction of those nuclear facilities.
Which it suggests might require capabilities potentially only possessed by the U.S.
That paints a very, very high-stakes picture. Failure to achieve one specific military objective could lead directly to the very proliferation outcome the operation aimed to prevent.
Exactly. Now, the second worst-case scenario the BBC analysis explores is, well, equally, if not maybe even more disruptive, the collapse of the Iranian regime itself.
Okay, so this is a scenario where the current political system in Iran just falls apart.
Yeah. And why is this potentially catastrophic, according to the source?
Because it would immediately create a massive, unpredictable power vacuum across a huge, strategically vital country.
And the predicted consequence is pretty grim. The source doesn't predict, a peaceful transition to democracy.
No.
No. It predicts civil war would erupt, leading swiftly to the emergence of numerous powerful terrorist militias.
Terrorist militias. And what kind?
The source specifies the likely nature of this threat. These would probably be Shia extremist groups, potentially even more radical than the current state-aligned proxies we see, with their own agendas, explicitly targeting the Gulf states and potentially the wider region.
Okay, that's terrifying.
Yeah. And the source draws a comparison here. It's a controversial one, we should note, by saying that the potential for internal extremists emerging in a weakened Iran is sort of similar to the potential for internal extremists appearing in other countries, like maybe Saudi Arabia or Egypt, if those states were similarly weakened and destabilized.
That is a controversial comparison.
It is, and it's worth pausing on that for a second because the source's point seems to be about the scale and type of unpredictable chaos that could be unleashed when a state weakens internally. But the comparison itself, yeah, it could be seen as oversimplifying the unique political and religious contexts of these different countries, maybe feeding into certain stereotypes.
Right. We should acknowledge the controversy of the comparison itself, but report that the source makes it to underscore the potential threat level.
Exactly. And the implication is stark. The cost of dealing with the chaos, the sectarian violence, the terrorism stemming from a fallen Iran would be immense, especially for neighboring countries who'd bear the immediate brunt of that instability spilling across their borders.
It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? Replacing a state actor, one you can potentially deter or negotiate with, however difficult that might be, with a fragmented landscape of non-state armed groups with extreme agendas.
Yeah, a transition from a difficult known to a potentially terrifying unknown.
Yeah.
Okay, so the third major scenario discussed by the BBC analysis involves the closure of strategic waterways.
The choke points. The risk here is Iran and its allies using their geography and naval capabilities to close key global maritime choke points.
Right. The source mentions a Reuters report citing an Iranian MP stating that Tehran is seriously considering closing the Strait of Hormuz.
Hormuz, one of the world's most critical arteries for oil and gas shipping. Closing that alone would send immediate shockwaves through the global economy.
Absolutely. But the BBC theory presented in the source adds a crucial compounding layer to this. They predict that the Houthis in Yemen, who are aligned with Iran, would likely simultaneously close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That's the one at the southern end of the Red Sea.
Both at once.
That's the theory. And the source points to recent instances of, apparently, simultaneous strikes by Iran and the Houthis as evidence of their continued operational coordination, suggesting this dual closure isn't just hypothetical, but maybe a real possibility they're considering or capable of.
Wow. Okay, closing both the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously. That would be exponentially more costly and disruptive than just closing one.
Hugely. The economic fallout detailed in the source is staggering.
Yeah.
It would cause massive disruption to global oil shipping, immediately driving up prices everywhere.
And the cost wouldn't just be global, would it? The source talks about regional impacts, too.
Oh, yeah. Immense costs for regional countries already suffering from the effects of conflict and general instability. The source gives specific examples. Jordan apparently closing its airspace because of overhead missile threats.
Right.
UAE flights to Oman being canceled. Egypt is mentioned as facing severe consequences. They're already struggling financially, right? They could potentially face cuts in gas supplies from Israel, forcing them to buy much more expensive LNG imports on the global market. And they could see rising currency and gold prices domestically as regional instability hammers their tourism and investment sectors.
The economic pain described sounds significant and immediate, and the source emphasizes the cost is effectively doubled for the Gulf states if both straits are closed. It would cripple their ability to export hydrocarbons.
It's a potential economic chokehold that would have truly global repercussions.
Okay. And then, maybe counterintuitively, the BBC analysis in the source asks this intriguing question. Who might actually benefit from all this escalation? From the instability, particularly the rising oil prices that would likely result from these scenarios.
Right. And their analysis points directly to Vladimir Putin. Why? The connection, as explained in the source, is brutally simple. Higher oil prices directly and significantly benefit the Russian government's budget.
Because they're a major oil and gas exporter.
Exactly. Higher prices per barrel translate directly into more revenue for the Russian state, providing crucial funding for Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine.
Okay, I see the connection.
And the implication drawn in the source is that this escalation in the Middle East could potentially make it harder for the U.S., which might already feel stretched to maintain its full level of support for Ukraine.
Why? Because the U.S. might get increasingly entangled, economically and maybe militarily, in the Middle East conflict.
That's the idea. Entanglement that could be triggered by incidents like, for example, the attack on the Ain al-Assad base in Iraq. The source notes that base was reportedly hit by 3 suicide drones attributed to Shia militias potentially linked to Iran.
Right, presented as an example of the kind of event that could draw the U.S. further in, maybe regardless of stated intentions or desires.
So these BBC scenarios, taken together, They paint a truly stark and interconnected picture. They show how the conflict between Israel and Iran isn't contained. It could spiral with really far-reaching and potentially devastating consequences.
Not just regionally nuclear risk, state collapse, but globally too,
Yeah.
impacting economies, energy markets, and maybe even influencing the dynamics of other major ongoing conflicts like the one in Ukraine.
It really highlights the ripple effect, the interconnectedness of global security and markets in a very visceral way.
It really does. All right, so we've looked at the big picture stuff, potential diplomatic maneuvers, deep intelligence ops, terrifying potential worst-case futures. Let's maybe zoom back in now, according to the sources, on a couple of very specific recent events and military focus points, things that offer clues about the ongoing tangible military dynamic right now.
Yeah, shifting from the macro and the hypothetical back to the micro and the concrete, drawing from the latest reporting in these sources.
Exactly. Beyond the huge overarching scenarios, the sources also shared some specific events from just the last few days or weeks that maybe offer clues about the ongoing military strategy and capabilities being used. One is the reported strike on the Weizmann Institute.
Right. The source details the specific Iranian action. It reports that Iran allegedly struck the Weizmann Institute of Science in Rehovot, that's south of Tel Aviv, directly with a missile,
Directly.
apparently. The source mentions seeing visual evidence of this reported strike.
And the source gives some context about the Weizmann Institute. It's not just a university.
Well, it notes it's Israel's first research center, founded way back in 1949, named after Ezra Weizmann, Israel's first president. But the source adds this key detail describing a somewhat secret aspect about this seemingly academic institution.
What's that?
It claims the center reportedly conducts laboratory and scientific activities that directly support the Israeli military and its weapons development.
Ah. So it suggests it's not solely a civilian academic body, but one involved in sensitive research with military applications.
That's the claim, which, if true, would provide a kind of strategic rationale from Iran's perspective for why it might be targeted, despite its public profile as a research institution.
Okay. Another recent point mentioned in the sources is a reported Iranian message that was conveyed via Cyprus.
Yeah, the source discusses this report that Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, reportedly used the Cypriot president as an intermediary, asking him to relay a message to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu.
That's a fascinating diplomatic backchannel, if true, via Cyprus.
It is, and the source notes that Netanyahu's office reportedly responded to this by specifically asking Israeli ministers not to make public statements about Iran following this reported communication.
Maybe trying to manage the messaging or perhaps avoid confirming the contact happened.
Could be, and the source highlights the intriguing question this raises. What message would the Iranian president want to send to Netanyahu at this incredibly tense point in the conflict? It just leaves that hanging there, really, open for speculation.
It definitely adds a layer of intrigue. Was it a warning? A de-escalation signal? Some kind of proposal? The source doesn't say, just reports the attempt to communicate via this unusual channel.
Now, shifting to Israel's reported military strategy, the source presents a pretty significant claim, apparently coming from within the Israeli military itself.
What's that?
They reportedly claim that they simply don't have enough interceptor missiles, things like Iron Dome or David Sling, to effectively counter all of Iran's potential launches, especially if Iran were to fire its full arsenal or engage in really prolonged missile campaigns.
Wow. That's a pretty surprising and significant admission, if accurate, given Israel's reputation for advanced air defense.
It is. And the reported consequence of this perceived shortage, according to the source's account of the Israeli military's view, is that their only viable strategic solution is to continue proactive offensive strikes against Iran's missile capabilities.
Right, the logic being, if you can't reliably shoot them all down defensively, you have to destroy them, or their launchers, before they can even be fired.
Exactly. And according to the source, Israel's current primary target set seems to reflect this strategy. It's reportedly not primarily focused on assassinating leaders or targeting scientists right now,
But rather,
hitting Iranian missile launchers.
missile launchers specifically. Why?
Well, this is a very specific tactical focus. The source explains the strategic reasoning provided. Before the current escalation really kicked off, Iran reportedly had a very large inventory of missiles, but a relative shortage of functional ready missile launchers.
Ah, okay. Lots of missiles, fewer ways to fire them.
Right. So destroying the launchers, therefore, has a kind of double impact. It eliminates a critical piece of hardware, and it simultaneously renders useless a portion of Iran's existing missile inventory because there's no way to fire them.
So it's described as inflicting a major systemic loss on Iran's ability to project power with missiles, a very specific, high-leverage target area.
That seems to be the logic presented. The source also reports on some very recent specific modifications to Israeli F-35 jets, apparently approved by the U.S.
F-35s, what modifications?
The claim is that Israel received U.S. approval to add external fuel tanks to its F-35 fighter jets.
External tanks. Doesn't that usually compromise the stealth of an aircraft like the F-35? Make it easier to detect?
Normally, yes, but the reported advantage claimed for these specific tanks is crucial. They're reportedly radar evading,
Radar evading fuel tanks. How?
apparently made of the same kind of stealthy material as the F-35 itself.
Okay. And the reported operational benefit.
This is significant. These tanks would reportedly allow the jets to strike deep into Iran and return without needing vulnerable mid-air refueling.
Right, which would offer a substantial operational advantage for long-range missions. Increases speed, reduces dependence on tanker aircraft, which are themselves large, slow targets.
Definitely. However, it's worth noting, and the source includes this detail, that there have reportedly been recent sightings of Israel's single, older 747 refueling tanker supporting Israeli jets on missions.
So that creates a slight discrepancy, or at least adds complexity to the idea that the F-35 mods completely eliminate the need for refueling on long-range strikes.
Exactly. It presents both pieces of information, leaving you to wonder about the full picture, or maybe different mission requirements, or maybe the modifications aren't fully rolled out yet. Who knows?
That's an important detail to hold on to, isn't it? Sometimes the publicly reported capabilities or modifications don't entirely align with observed actions. Highlights the difficulty in getting a completely definitive picture of military operations.
For sure. And finally, the source reiterates a point made earlier, highlighted again near the end of the material as a key takeaway. Israeli aircraft reportedly enjoying what's described as freedom of flight over Tehran, over the Iranian capital itself.
Freedom of flight over Tehran.
Yeah, the source compares this reported freedom of movement over Tehran to flights over areas like Lebanon or Syria, which are typically much more contested airspace for Israeli jets, usually involving greater risk from anti-air threats.
So operating over the capital is seen as easier or safer somehow.
That's the implication given. And the significance stressed in the source is immense. It's described as a momentous situation. If Israeli aircraft can operate with relative impunity over the capital, it represents a significant failure and loss for Iran's integrated air defense systems. The source states quite pointedly that Iran cannot continue without air defenses if this situation persists, implying this is an unsustainable state for Iran.
Wow. Okay. These specific details, the targeting of military R&D, the diplomatic feelers via Cyprus, the reported missile shortage driving strategy, the F-35 modifications, and this perceived freedom of the skies over the capital. They really show the tactical realities and strategic adaptations happening on the ground and in the air right now, don't they? It's the granular layer of the conflict underneath those potential grand scenarios we talked about.
Absolutely. It gives you a sense of the specific problems and solutions military planners on both sides are reportedly grappling with in real time.
Okay, so we've really gone deep into these sources now. We've established some key points, those surprising, maybe even conflicting claims about potential oil for security deals.
Right, the FT piece.
The intricate details of that potentially multi-year covert drone infiltration operation from the WSJ.
Incredible stuff.
The terrifying possibilities of nuclearization or regional collapse outlined in the BBC analysis.
Yeah, the worst case scenarios.
And these specific tactical details about targeting priorities like launchers and technological adaptations like the F-35 tanks. What does this all mean when we try and bring it together? What's the big picture from all this?
Well, when you look at the whole picture painted by these diverse sources, you really see the incredibly high stakes involved. They're laid bare, especially by that BBC analysis of worst-case scenarios.
Yeah.
We're talking about tangible risks of nuclear proliferation if certain facilities aren't dealt with effectively. Widespread regional instability, chaos even stemming from potential regime collapse, and a global economic shock from the closure of vital shipping lanes.
And it's important we acknowledge, too, that the source material reflects some very strong viewpoints and deep feelings about the human cost and the political dimensions of this conflict.
Definitely. The discussion within the source material includes arguments about, who should prevail, expressions of sympathy for ordinary Iranians separate from their government.
Right, and some strong labeling of one side's military actions as criminal, assertions that Iran must win to achieve certain regional goals, the argument that Iran's potential fall might only benefit figures like Netanyahu.
And the idea that Israel perhaps needs to face losses in the conflict to reestablish deterrence. These are perspectives expressed within the source material we've analyzed.
Exactly, reflecting the intensity of the views surrounding this conflict. And we're conveying them impartially as part of what the sources contain without adopting them as our own views or judgments.
That impartial reporting of the source's content, including those strong viewpoints they contain, is really key to understanding the full picture they present. And as you pointed out earlier, there's also that element of complexity and sometimes outright uncertainty or conflicting information within the sources themselves.
Right. Those contradictory reports we saw, like the initial FT headline about the oil deal versus the U.S. official quotes dismissing it, or the claim about the F-35 range eliminating refueling needs versus the actual sighting of the refueling plane.
Yeah.
It shows how difficult it is, even for well-placed journalists, to get a single, complete, definitive picture of what's happening in such a layered and opaque situation. Information warfare, secrecy, it's all part of the conflict itself.
It really underscores that analysis requires grappling with ambiguity, with conflicting reports, rather than expecting or seeking a single, simple truth all the time.
So for you, the listener, processing all this information from the sources, the key takeaway, maybe, is to see the multitude of layers at play here. This conflict isn't just about military strikes or missile exchanges. It's deeply intertwined with economic pressures, economic incentives,
Intelligence battles operating deep in the shadows.
and potential political shakeups that could completely alter the regional landscape for generations.
Yeah.
It's about understanding this incredibly complex interplay of different forces and possibilities that are shaping the situation right now.
And understanding why, as the sources really highlight, it matters far beyond the immediate region. The scenarios we discussed, the potential impact on oil prices, the closure of streets affecting global shipping, the terrifying possibility of nuclearization,
Right.
all have global ramifications. They could affect economies, energy security, international politics, far, far from the Middle East. It's a situation with tendrils reaching across the world.
It truly is. So as we wrap things up on this deep dive,
Okay.
we've really delved into the main themes explored in these sources. Those surprising claims about potential oil deals and their complex reality, the intricate, almost cinematic details of covert drone infiltration.
The very serious and alarming possibilities of nuclearization, regional collapse, global economic disruption outlined by the BBC.
And the specific tactical focus on targets like missile launchers and strategic R&D facilities, plus those tech adaptations.
It's definitely a lot to absorb. But hopefully, seeing these different layers illuminated by the sources provides a clearer, if perhaps, well, maybe more worrying picture of what's going on.
It certainly does. And given the incredibly complex web of factors we've uncovered here, from reports of secret mines potentially holding enriched uranium to the potential for total devastating regional chaos described if a regime were to fall, to the strategic cat-and-mouse game with missile launchers. This deep dive really raises an important, maybe the most important question, doesn't it?
Which is?
In a conflict with so many catastrophic potential outcomes described in these sources, what does a realistic path towards de-escalation even look like from here? And crucially, who has the leverage or maybe even the will to pursue it effectively?
That question really captures the profound challenge presented by all these dynamics we've discussed. What is the path out?
And on that note, we hope this deep dive has given you a much clearer, more detailed picture of the very high stakes involved, based directly on these compelling sources we looked at. Stay curious, keep those questions coming.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
And make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive to get these in-depth explorations of complex topics delivered right to you, pulling back the curtain on the information that matters.